I always thought I had a solid grasp on life, like I was playing with a well-shuffled deck. Nothing fancy, just the basics, a steady job, a decent home, and a wife I loved. Emily and I had been married for almost 15 years. We met in college, and from the moment I saw her, I was hooked. She was smart, ambitious, and had this magnetic charm that pulled me in like a moth to a flame. We built our lives together, moved into a cozy house in the suburbs, and even adopted a dog we named Max, our practice baby before we planned for kids that never came. We were happy, or at least, I thought we were. For years our relationship was like clockwork. We had our routines, our little rituals that made life feel stable and predictable. Every Saturday we'd go to the local farmer's market, grab fresh produce, and spend the day cooking together. Sunday nights were reserved for our Netflix binges, where we'd curl up on the couch with Max snoring at our feet. It wasn't the stuff of fairy tales, but it was ours, and I cherished it. But then, about 6 months ago, things started to shift. It wasn't obvious at first, just little things that didn't quite add up. Emily began working late more often, something that was unusual given her consistent schedule as a graphic designer. She always had deadlines, sure, but now she was suddenly swamped, constantly talking about a new project that required her full attention. Then there were the nights out with her friends, which became more frequent. She used to invite me along, but lately I was getting more and more, "You wouldn't enjoy it," or "It's just a girls' night" excuses. The first time I really felt the change was one night after she'd come home late. She had this distant look in her eyes, like she was physically present but mentally miles away. I asked her about it, but she brushed me off with some vague excuse about work stress. I wanted to believe her. I really did. But that nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach wouldn't go away. Then there was the phone. Emily had always been open about her phone, leaving it lying around, not caring if I used it to check a message or make a call. But suddenly, she started keeping it close, like a lifeline she couldn't afford to lose. I noticed she'd turn the screen away from me when a notification popped up or take her phone with her into the bathroom, something she'd never done before. One time, she left it on the kitchen counter while she was in the shower, and I saw a message flash across the screen from someone named Sam. It was a simple "can't wait to see you," but it felt like a punch to the gut. "Who's Sam?" I asked when she came back into the room. She froze for just a fraction of a second, so brief I almost missed it, before casually answering, "Oh, he's just a guy from work. We've been collaborating on a project." I tried to convince myself it was nothing, that I was being paranoid. But deep down, I knew something was off. Sam wasn't just a guy from work, and this wasn't just a project. But how do you confront someone you love when you're not even sure if what you're feeling is real or just some paranoid fantasy? It all came to a head one Friday night. Emily had gone out with her friends, or at least that's what she told me. I was supposed to go out with some buddies, but I wasn't feeling up to it. Something kept me home that night, a gnawing anxiety I couldn't shake. Around midnight, I got a call from Mike, a friend I hadn't seen much of lately. He was slurring his words, clearly drunk, and laughing about how he'd just had the wildest night out with some old college pals. "Dude, you should have come. Em was there too. She was on fire tonight, dancing with everyone, even Sam. You remember Sam, right?" I felt the room spin. "Sam from college? Yeah, man!" They were thick as thieves all night, almost like they were the only ones in the room. I don't remember how the conversation ended. My mind was racing, trying to piece together what I'd just heard. Emily wasn't out with her usual friends. She was with Sam, the Sam from college, the one she'd always mentioned in passing, never with much detail, the one she'd had a thing with before we got together, a fling she'd dismissed as meaningless when we started dating. The rest of the night was a blur. I couldn't sleep, couldn't think straight. I kept imagining Emily with him, their bodies close, laughing, touching, everything she used to do with me. When she finally stumbled in around 2 in the morning, her clothes slightly disheveled, I felt sick. "Did you have fun?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Yeah," she said, a little too quickly. "Just the usual." I wanted to scream, to demand the truth, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Instead, I nodded and went to bed, leaving her in the living room where she sat in silence. The next morning, I woke up to find her already up, making breakfast like nothing had happened. But something had happened. Something that would change everything. That morning, as I watched her move around the kitchen, the realization hit me like a ton of bricks. Emily was hiding something from me, and I was determined to find out what it was, no matter how much it hurt. So, I began to dig. Little by little, I started paying more attention to the details I'd once overlooked. I checked our phone bill, noticing more frequent calls and texts to a number I didn't recognize. I tried to hack into her email, but she'd changed the password. It was as if she knew I was on to her, that I was starting to suspect the truth she was so desperately trying to keep hidden. It was a game of cat and mouse, and I was losing. The more I searched, the more she seemed to cover her tracks. But I was determined. I couldn't go on living like this, drowning in doubt and suspicion. I needed proof. I needed to know for sure if my wife was betraying me with another man, especially with someone I once called a friend. And when I found out, it wasn't just the cheating that broke me. It was who she chose to betray me with that turned my world upside down. The day I finally found out the truth was like any other. Emily was getting ready for another night out, claiming she was meeting her usual group of friends. But I knew better. The cracks in her story were becoming more evident, and my suspicions were no longer just shadows lurking in the corners of my mind. They were front and center, demanding answers. I sat in the living room, pretending to watch TV while Emily fussed over her appearance. She'd spent more time than usual getting ready, carefully choosing her outfit, fixing her hair, and applying just the right amount of makeup. She looked stunning, almost too stunning for a simple night out with friends. I noticed the slight tremor in her hands as she applied her lipstick, the way she kept checking her phone for messages. Every detail screamed that she was on edge, nervous about something. "Are you sure you're just going out with the girls?" I asked, trying to keep my tone casual. She glanced at me through the mirror, her expression carefully neutral. "Of course. Why?" "No reason. Just seems like you're putting in a lot of effort." She laughed, but it sounded forced. "You know how we girls are. It's just for fun." I nodded, but my mind was already racing. Something didn't add up, and I was done ignoring the signs. The moment she left, I decided to follow her. It wasn't something I was proud of, but I needed to know the truth. The thought of hiring a private investigator had crossed my mind more than once, but I realized I had to see it with my own eyes. If Emily was cheating on me, I had to catch her in the act. After she left, I waited a few minutes before grabbing my keys and heading out. I knew the route she usually took, so I kept a safe distance, careful not to be seen. The streets were quiet, the evening just settling in with a soft twilight glow. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing the fear that I was about to uncover something that would destroy me. She drove through town, making her way to a part of the city we rarely visited. It wasn't long before she pulled into the parking lot of a bar, a place I recognized instantly. It was a trendy spot, one we'd frequented years ago when we were still in the honeymoon phase of our relationship. A place that held good memories, now tainted by what I feared was happening inside. I parked a few spots away, my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. I watched as she got out of the car, glancing around like she was checking to make sure she hadn't been followed. Then, she walked toward the entrance, her stride confident, her face set in determination. I waited for a few minutes before getting out of the car and following her inside. The bar was dimly lit, filled with people unwinding after a long week. I scanned the room, my eyes darting from face to face, looking for Emily. Then I saw her, sitting at a table near the back, not alone. She was with a man, tall, dark-haired, with a face that was all too familiar. Sam. My stomach dropped. It felt like all the air had been sucked out of the room. There they were, laughing, talking, sitting close enough that their knees touched under the table. Emily's hand rested casually on Sam's arm as if it belonged there. And then, as if to confirm my worst fears, she leaned in and kissed him. It wasn't a peck on the cheek or a friendly gesture. It was a kiss, a deep, lingering kiss that spoke volumes about their relationship. My vision blurred with rage and heartbreak. The scene unfolding in front of me was the stuff of nightmares, and I was living it. I wanted to storm over there, to rip them apart and demand answers. But I knew that would only end in a public spectacle, and I wasn't ready for that. Instead, I pulled out my phone and took a few pictures, capturing the damning evidence. It felt surreal, watching my wife, the woman I had shared my life with for 15 years, kissing another man like I didn't even exist. I left the bar before they could see me, my head spinning with a million thoughts. How long had this been going on? How had I been so blind? The pain was overwhelming, a searing heat in my chest that made it hard to breathe. The betrayal cut deeper than I'd imagined, not just because she was cheating, but because it was with Sam, a man I once considered a friend. The drive home was a blur. I felt like I was on autopilot, my mind too numb to process everything I had just witnessed. When I finally walked through the door, the silence of the house was deafening. Max, sensing something was wrong, came over and nudged my hand with his nose, his eyes full of concern. I patted his head absent-mindedly, my thoughts a chaotic mess. I needed a plan. I couldn't just confront Emily without knowing the full extent of her betrayal. So, I decided to dig deeper. I accessed her laptop while she was out the next day, something I never would have done before all this. Her email was still open, and what I found there confirmed my worst fears. Dozens of emails between her and Sam, some going back months. They weren't just lovers, they were planning a future together. The messages were filled with talk of secret getaways, of fantasies they wanted to explore, of love. I felt like I was drowning. Each email was another weight dragging me down, making it harder to breathe. I scrolled through the conversations, my hands shaking, my eyes burning with unshed tears. There were photos too, intimate pictures of them together, laughing, smiling, kissing. Each image was a knife to the heart, a reminder of the life they were building behind my back. But the final straw was the message she sent just before leaving that night. Can't wait to see you tonight. I need you. I love you. She had never said those words to me with such urgency, such passion. It was clear. Her heart was no longer mine. I printed everything, the emails, the photos, knowing I'd need them if this went to court. I felt sick doing it, like I was betraying the woman I loved, but I knew I had no choice. Emily had already betrayed me in the worst possible way. That night, I stayed up late, sitting in the dark with a bottle of whiskey, trying to numb the pain. When Emily came home, she was all smiles, her eyes bright with the glow of someone who had just been with the person they loved. She tried to kiss me goodnight, but I turned away, unable to stomach the thought of her lips on mine after knowing where they had been. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice laced with concern. But there was a hint of something else. Guilt, maybe? Or fear that I knew more than I was letting on. "I'm fine," I lied, my voice cold. "Just tired." She hesitated, like she wanted to say something, but then she nodded and went to bed. I waited until I heard her breathing even out before I allowed myself to break down. The tears came hard and fast, years of love and trust unraveling in a matter of minutes. The next morning, I woke up with a pounding headache and a heart that felt like it had been shattered into 1,000 pieces. Emily was already up, moving around the kitchen, humming to herself like everything was perfectly normal. But nothing was normal anymore. Everything had changed. I watched her from the doorway, my mind replaying the images from the night before. The kiss, the emails, the lies. I wanted to confront her, to demand answers, but I wasn't ready. Not yet. I needed to gather my thoughts, to figure out how to handle this without losing everything. As I stood there, the anger slowly began to build. It started as a low simmer, bubbling under the surface, and then it grew, fed by the memories of all the lies, all the deceit. Emily had destroyed our marriage, our life together. And for what? A fling with someone who meant nothing to her, or so she'd claim when I finally confronted her. But that confrontation would come later. First, I needed to decide what to do next. Revenge was on my mind, a dark, twisted part of me that wanted to make her pay for what she'd done. But I had to be smart about it. I couldn't let my emotions take over, not when there was so much at stake. For now, I would play the part of the oblivious husband, watching, waiting, and planning my next move. Emily might have thought she had the upper hand, but she was wrong. She'd made a fool out of me once, but it wouldn't happen again. I was done being the nice guy. The day I kicked her out was a day I'll never forget. It started like any other. Emily was acting normal, as if everything in our marriage was perfectly fine. But I knew better. I had spent the last few days gathering my strength, letting the anger replace the hurt, planning every detail of the confrontation. I was done playing the fool. Emily came home from work that evening, carrying groceries like she usually did on Fridays. She smiled at me as she walked through the door, acting like nothing was wrong, like she hadn't been sneaking around behind my back with a man I once considered a friend. The sight of her acting so casual, so comfortable in her deceit, made my blood boil. "Hey, honey," she said, her voice light and cheerful. "I grabbed everything we need for dinner tonight. I was thinking we could have pasta and open that bottle of red we've been saving." I looked at her, barely able to contain the disgust bubbling up inside me. "Sure," I replied, my voice flat. "But first, we need to talk." She froze, her eyes narrowing slightly as she looked at me. I could see the gears turning in her head, the flicker of fear that she was about to be exposed. "About what?" she asked, trying to keep her tone neutral. But there was an edge to her voice that hadn't been there before. "About us. About our marriage," I said, standing up from the couch and walking over to the kitchen counter where she was putting the groceries away. I was close enough now to smell her perfume, the same scent she used to wear when we first started dating. The scent that used to make my heart race now made my stomach turn. "Okay," she said slowly, turning to face me fully. "What's this about, Jake? You're acting strange." "Am I?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "Or maybe I'm just seeing things clearly for the first time in a long while." She swallowed hard, her eyes darting around the room as if looking for an escape. But there was none. Not this time. "Jake, you're scaring me. What's going on?" I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what I was about to do. "I know about you and Sam, Emily. I know everything." Her face drained of color, her eyes widening in shock. For a moment she was speechless, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. "What are you talking about?" she finally managed to say, her voice trembling. "Don't play dumb with me," I snapped, my anger flaring up. "I saw you with him at the bar. I've seen the emails, the photos. You've been lying to me for months, maybe longer. How long, Emily? How long have you been screwing around with him behind my back?" She stepped back as if I'd slapped her, her eyes filling with tears. But I wasn't moved by them. Not this time. "Jake, I can explain." "Explain?" I interrupted, my voice rising. "Explain what? How you've been betraying me? How you've been sneaking around, lying to my face, pretending like everything is fine while you're off having the time of your life with another man?" "It's not what you think!" she cried, her voice breaking. "Please, Jake, let me explain. It wasn't supposed to be like this." "Then how is it supposed to be?" I demanded, taking a step closer to her. "Were you planning on leaving me for him? Is that what all those emails were about? Building a new life together while I'm left in the dark, wondering where the hell it all went wrong?" "No!" she shouted, shaking her head violently. "No, Jake, I swear! I wasn't going to leave you! It was just—" She broke off, sobbing, covering her face with her hands. "Just what, Emily?" I spat, my voice dripping with venom. "Just sex? Just a fling? How long has this been going on? How long have you been lying to me?" She looked up at me, her eyes red and swollen with tears. "It started a few months ago," she whispered. "I didn't mean for it to happen, Jake. I swear. It just happened. We reconnected, and one thing led to another, but it didn't mean anything. It was just bullshit," I roared, slamming my fist down on the counter. "Don't stand there and tell me it didn't mean anything when you've been carrying on with him for months, when you've been planning a future with him behind my back." She flinched, her sobs growing louder, but I didn't care. I was done with her lies, done with the excuses. "Get out," I said coldly. She froze, staring at me in disbelief. "What?" "I said get out," I repeated, my voice ice cold. "Pack your things and get the hell out of my house. We're done." "Jake, please!" she begged, stepping closer to me, her hands reaching out as if to touch me, to comfort me. "Don't do this. We can fix this. I swear. We can go to counseling. We can—" "There's nothing to fix," I snapped, jerking away from her touch. "You destroyed everything the moment you decided to sleep with him. I can't even look at you without feeling sick. So pack your bags and get out before I throw you out myself." She stared at me, her face crumpling with despair. "But where will I go?" she whispered, her voice trembling with fear. "Go to him," I said coldly. "Go to Sam. You seem to be doing just fine with him." Maybe he'll take you in after you've destroyed our marriage. She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. Jake, please, I'm begging you, don't do this. I love you. I never wanted to hurt you. It was a mistake, a stupid mistake. Please, we can get through this. We can make it right. Make it right? I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. You think you can make this right? You think you can just say sorry and everything will go back to the way it was? It's too late for that, Emily. It's too fucking late. She sobbed, collapsing onto the floor as if her legs had given out. She looked up at me, her eyes pleading, but I felt nothing but contempt. The woman I loved, the woman I had built a life with, was gone. In her place was a stranger, a liar, a cheat. Please, Jake, she whispered, her voice broken. Please don't do this. But I was done listening to her. I turned my back on her and walked out of the kitchen, my heart pounding with a mix of rage and relief. I had made my decision, and there was no going back. She needed to leave, and I needed her gone. I went to the bedroom and grabbed a suitcase from the closet, throwing it on the bed. I didn't care what she took, I just wanted her out. I walked back to the kitchen and tossed the suitcase at her feet. Pack your shit and go, I said, my voice hard as steel. You have an hour. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with shock. You can't be serious, she whispered. Dead serious, I replied. And if you're not gone in an hour, I'll call the police and have you removed. She stared at me, disbelief and horror etched on her face. But she knew I wasn't bluffing. She nodded slowly, wiping the tears from her eyes as she got to her feet. Okay, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Okay, Jake, I'll go. I watched her walk down the hallway to our bedroom, her shoulders slumped, defeated. Part of me wanted to follow her, to wrap my arms around her and tell her everything would be okay. But I couldn't. That part of me had been shattered beyond repair. I stood in the living room, listening to the sounds of her packing, a drawer opening, clothes being stuffed into the suitcase, a muffled sob here and there. Max, sensing the tension, stayed by my side, his head resting on my leg. I patted him absently, my mind racing with thoughts of what was to come. After what felt like an eternity, Emily reappeared, dragging the suitcase behind her. Her eyes were red and puffy, her face streaked with tears. She stood in the doorway, looking at me like she was waiting for something. An apology. A second chance I didn't know. But all I had left to give her was silence. I'm sorry, Jake, she whispered, her voice trembling. I never meant for it to end like this. Neither did I replied, my voice cold. But you made your choice, Emily. Now you have to live with it. She nodded, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks as she turned and walked out the door. I listened to the sound of her footsteps fading away, the soft click of the front door closing behind her. And just like that, she was gone. I stood there for a long time, staring at the empty space where she had been, feeling a strange mix of emotions. Relief, anger, sorrow, it all swirled together, leaving me feeling numb. I had done what I needed to do, but the reality of it all hadn't fully sunk in yet. When I finally moved, it was to lock the door, a symbolic gesture that this chapter of my life was over. Emily was gone, and with her, the life we had built together. Now, all that was left was to pick up the pieces and figure out what the hell I was going to do next. But one thing was certain. I was done being a victim. I was done being played for a fool. Emily had underestimated me, thinking she could keep her affair hidden forever. But she was wrong. I had caught her, exposed her lies, and now she was out of my life for good. I sat down on the couch, Max hopping up beside me, resting his head on my lap. I stroked his fur, the weight of the day finally crashing down on me. The house felt eerily quiet, the silence oppressive. But at least it was my silence. No more lies, no more deceit. And as I sat there staring at the wall, I knew that this was just the beginning. There was still so much to process, so much to sort through. But I'd take it one step at a time, one day at a time. I had been betrayed, humiliated, but I wasn't broken. I'd get through this, and I'd come out stronger on the other side. As the days passed after I kicked Emily out, the anger that simmered inside me slowly transformed into something darker, something that demanded retribution. I couldn't just let her walk away after everything she had done. She had shattered our marriage, destroyed our life together, and humiliated me. And now, I was going to make sure she paid for it. This wasn't about moving on or turning the other cheek. This was about justice. My kind of justice. Emily was still staying with Sam, as far as I knew. She'd sent a couple of texts, weak attempts at reconciliation, but I ignored them. She needed to understand that I wasn't interested in patching things up, that what we had was dead and buried. But that didn't mean I was done with her, not by a long shot. The first step in my plan was to take control of our finances. Over the years, I had made sure that all our accounts were joint, giving me easy access to everything. It didn't take long to drain the accounts, leaving Emily with nothing. I wasn't interested in leaving her high and dry permanently. I wasn't that heartless. But I wanted to make sure she felt the sting of losing everything she'd taken for granted. Next, I froze her credit cards. It was a simple enough task, given that I was the primary account holder on most of them. With a few clicks, her access to money was gone. I imagined her standing at some store counter, trying to buy groceries or clothes, only to have her card declined. The thought brought a dark satisfaction I hadn't felt in days. I also decided to sell the car she had been using. It was under my name, after all. She had always loved that car, sleek, black, and a bit of a status symbol. I posted it online, and within a week it was gone, replaced by a hefty deposit in my bank account. I wondered if she'd even noticed yet, if she'd come out one morning expecting to drive off and found an empty space in the driveway instead. While I was dismantling her life financially, I was also plotting something more personal, something that would leave a mark on her reputation, something she couldn't simply walk away from. Emily had always cared deeply about how people saw her. She had a carefully curated image, one that didn't include adulterous wife as a descriptor. It was time to tear that down. She was still active on social media, posting pictures and updates that made it seem like nothing was wrong, as if she hadn't just wrecked her marriage. That facade was about to come crashing down. I had saved all the emails, all the photos, every piece of evidence of her affair with Sam. And now, it was time to make them public. I created a new anonymous account and began uploading the emails, the pictures, even screenshots of the texts she had sent him. I tagged her in every post, making sure they were visible to her family, her friends, and anyone else who had ever thought she was a decent person. The images of her in Sam's arms, the messages where she professed her love for him, nothing was off limits. I wanted everyone to see the truth, to know the kind of person she really was. The fallout was immediate. Within hours, her social media blew up. People were commenting, sharing, sending messages of shock, disgust, and betrayal. Her friends and family reached out to her, some offering pity, others cutting ties completely. It was everything I'd hoped for and more. Her perfect image was shattered, replaced by a truth she could no longer deny. But I wasn't done yet. I knew that Emily's work life was important to her, more important than she'd ever let on. She had worked hard to build a career as a graphic designer, and her reputation in the industry was solid, or at least it had been. I made sure that the evidence of her affair found its way into the inboxes of her colleagues and her boss. The emails I sent were blunt, unflinching, detailing how she'd spent more time with Sam than on the projects she was being paid to complete. The company she worked for had a strict policy on employee conduct, especially when it came to maintaining a professional image. I knew this because I'd read the employee handbook she'd left lying around one day, and I knew that the information I'd provided would force them to take action. Sure enough, within days, she was called into a meeting and put on administrative leave while they investigated. I couldn't help but smile at the thought of her squirming in that meeting, knowing her career was hanging by a thread. The final blow came when I contacted her family directly. I'd always gotten along well with her parents, but they were traditional, with little tolerance for scandal. I sent them everything. Copies of the emails, the pictures, the details of the affair. I didn't hold back. They needed to know who their daughter really was, how she had betrayed the man who had loved her for years. Her mother called me, voice trembling with disbelief. "Jake, is this true? Did Emily really do this?" "Yes," I said, my voice steady. "It's all true. I'm sorry you had to find out this way, but she left me no choice." There was silence on the other end of the line, then a quiet sob. "Thank you for telling us, Jake. We'll deal with this." Her father, usually a man of few words, sent me a text the next day. "I'm sorry, son. You didn't deserve this. We'll support you in whatever you decide to do next." I knew they would confront her. that they would be devastated by her actions, and I knew it would crush her to lose their respect and support. But she had made her bed, and now she would have to lie in it. Days passed, and the silence from Emily was telling. No more texts, no more calls, just the occasional word from mutual friends about how she was falling apart. Her friends were abandoning her career was in jeopardy, and her parents were furious. Everything she'd built was crumbling around her, and I didn't feel an ounce of guilt. She had brought this on herself. But the final, most satisfying act of revenge came when I learned that Sam had broken things off with her. Apparently, the public exposure had been too much for him. He wasn't willing to lose his own family and reputation over an affair that had now become common knowledge. He left her to deal with the wreckage on her own, like the coward I always knew he was. When I heard about it, I couldn't help but laugh. She was alone, with no one left to turn to. Everything she had thought she was gaining by betraying me had vanished, leaving her with nothing. I had destroyed her life, piece by piece, just as she had destroyed mine. And as I sat in the quiet of my home, sipping a glass of whiskey, I felt a sense of closure. The pain of her betrayal was still there, deep down, but it was duller now, overshadowed by the satisfaction of knowing she was paying the price for her actions. Emily had taken everything from me, but in the end, I had taken everything from her as well, and that, in its own twisted way, brought me peace. Now, all that was left was Sam. He might have walked away from Emily, but he wasn't going to walk away unscathed. He had played a part in this mess, and it was time for him to face the consequences. With Emily out of the picture, my attention turned to the man who had helped destroy my marriage, Sam. The thought of him made my blood boil. He wasn't just some random guy she'd met. He was someone I'd known, someone I'd once considered a friend. That made his betrayal even more personal, and I knew I couldn't let him get away with it. Just like I had with Emily, I was going to dismantle his life piece by piece. Sam had always been the kind of guy who seemed to have everything going for him. A decent job, a loving wife, 2 kids, and a nice house in a respectable neighborhood. From the outside, his life looked perfect. But I knew the truth now, and I was going to make sure everyone else knew it too. The first thing I did was dig into his professional life. He worked as a project manager at a mid-sized tech company, where he was well-liked and respected. But I knew something that his colleagues didn't. Sam had been using company resources to carry on his affair with Emily. He had sent her emails from his work account, scheduled their meetings during work hours, and even used company funds to pay for their little rendezvous. I had proof of all of this, courtesy of the emails and messages I had saved from Emily's accounts. I compiled everything into a neat little package. Screenshots of the emails, the dates and times he had left work early, receipts for expenses he'd charged to the company, all of it. Then I anonymously sent the package to the company's HR department, along with a note explaining exactly what Sam had been up to on company time. I knew it wouldn't be long before they took action. Sure enough, it didn't take long for the fallout to begin. Within a week, Sam was called into a meeting with HR and the company's legal team. They confronted him with the evidence, and from what I heard, he didn't even try to deny it. How could he? The proof was irrefutable. He was suspended immediately, pending further investigation, but I knew there was no way he was getting out of this with just a slap on the wrist. At best, he was looking at termination. At worst, there could be legal consequences for the misuse of company funds. But I wasn't content with just ruining his career. Sam needed to feel the same pain and humiliation that I had felt. He needed to lose everything, just like I had. So I turned my attention to his personal life. Sam's wife, Rachel, was someone I had met a few times at social gatherings. She seemed like a nice enough woman, dedicated to her family, always polite and friendly. I wondered if she had any idea what her husband had been up to. The thought of her being in the dark, just like I had been, infuriated me. She deserved to know the truth, and I was going to make sure she found out. I gathered the same evidence I had used to destroy Emily's life. The emails, the photos, the text messages, and I sent them to Rachel. I didn't bother with an anonymous email this time. I wanted her to know exactly where it was coming from. I included a brief message, explaining that I was sorry she had to find out this way, but that she deserved to know what her husband had been doing behind her back. The response was immediate. Rachel called me the next day, her voice trembling with shock and anger. "Jake, is this true?" she asked, barely able to get the words out. "Did Sam really—" "Yes, Rachel," I said, my voice steady. It's all true. I'm sorry you have to go through this, but I thought you should know. She was silent for a long time, and I could hear her trying to hold back tears. Thank you for telling me, she finally said, her voice breaking. I need to think about what to do next. I felt a pang of sympathy for her. She was an innocent victim in all of this, just like I had been. But that sympathy didn't stop me from feeling satisfied. Sam was about to lose everything. His job, his reputation, and now his family. Over the next few days, I kept tabs on Sam through mutual acquaintances. It didn't take long for the news to spread. People were talking, whispering about how Sam had been caught cheating, how his wife had kicked him out, how he was on the verge of losing his job. His perfect life was crumbling, just as I had planned. But I wasn't done yet. There was one more piece of Sam's life that needed to be destroyed: his standing in the community. Sam had always been active in the local scene, coaching his son's Little League team, volunteering at church events, and generally being the kind of guy people looked up to. That was about to change. I made sure the evidence of his affair made its way to the right people. The parents on the Little League team, the church members, the neighbors who had always admired him. I wanted them all to see the real Sam, the man who had betrayed his wife and destroyed another man's marriage. The whispers turned into outright gossip, and soon Sam was a pariah in his own community. He was forced to resign from his volunteer positions, and people began avoiding him in public, refusing to associate with a man who had so thoroughly disgraced himself. Rachel filed for divorce soon after, and from what I heard, she wasn't going to make it easy for him. She had a good lawyer, and she was determined to get everything she could: full custody of the kids, the house, the savings, everything. Sam was left with nothing but the clothes on his back and the realization that he had lost everything that mattered. I'll admit, there was a part of me that felt a grim satisfaction as I watched it all unfold. Sam had destroyed my life, and now I had destroyed his. But as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, I began to feel something else, a sense of emptiness. I had gotten my revenge, but it hadn't brought me the peace I had hoped for. One day, I ran into Rachel at the grocery store. She looked tired, worn down, but there was a strength in her that hadn't been there before. She smiled weakly when she saw me and walked over, pushing her cart with one hand, while her young daughter clung to the other. "Jake," she said, her voice softer than I remembered, "I just wanted to say thank you for telling me the truth. It was hard, but I needed to know." I nodded, unsure of what to say. "I'm sorry for everything you had to go through," I finally managed. She shook her head, her smile fading. "Don't be. It's not your fault. Sam made his choices. Now we all have to live with them." We stood there in awkward silence for a moment before she glanced at her daughter and then back at me. "I hope you find peace, Jake," she said quietly. "I really do." "Thank you," I replied, watching as she turned and walked away, leaving me alone in the aisle. As I drove home that day, her words echoed in my mind. I had been so focused on revenge, so consumed by my anger, that I hadn't thought about what would come after. I had destroyed the lives of the people who had hurt me, but in the process, I had also destroyed a part of myself. The realization hit me hard. I had won, but at what cost? Sam's life was in ruins. Emily's was too, and I had made sure of that. But now, as I sat in the quiet of my home, I realized that revenge hadn't brought me the closure I had been seeking. It had only deepened the emptiness I felt inside. I had taken everything from them, but it hadn't filled the void they had left in me. And now I was left to pick up the pieces of my own life, to figure out what came next. Revenge had been sweet, but it was a bitter sweetness, one that left a lingering taste of regret. As I sat there, staring at the walls of the house that had once been filled with love and laughter, I knew that I had to find a way to move forward. I had destroyed their lives, but now it was time to rebuild mine. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't be quick, but it was the only way to find the peace that had eluded me for so long. And so, with a heavy heart and a mind full of regrets, I began the long process of healing, knowing that the path to redemption would be a hard one. But it was a path I had to take, for my own sake, and for the sake of whatever future lay ahead. The decision to file for divorce was one I had been turning over in my mind for days, maybe even weeks. After everything that had happened, after discovering the affair, kicking Emily out, and exacting my revenge, I knew there was no going back. Our marriage was beyond repair. But this wasn't just about ending things. It was about reclaiming control, about making sure that I was the one who dictated how it would end. Emily had tried reaching out to me several times after I kicked her out, sending texts and leaving voicemails that ranged from pleading for forgiveness to angry rants about how I was overreacting. I ignored every single one. I was done with her lies, done with her excuses. She had made her bed, and now she was going to lie in it. Alone. Filing for divorce without telling her was a calculated move. I wanted to catch her off guard, to make sure she understood that this was final, that there was no chance for reconciliation. I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of a conversation where she could try to manipulate me, to twist my words, to play the victim. I was taking the power back, and I was going to do it on my terms. I met with my lawyer, a no-nonsense woman named Sarah, who had handled cases like mine 1,000 times before. She listened to my story, took notes, and assured me that we would get through this quickly and efficiently. She recommended filing on grounds of adultery, which would make the process smoother given the evidence I had. "I'll take care of everything," she said, her voice calm and confident. "You'll just need to sign the papers, and then we'll serve her. She won't see it coming." And that was exactly what I wanted. I signed the papers that same day, feeling a strange sense of relief as I did. It was like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders, a sense that this chapter of my life was finally closing. I left Sarah's office with a plan in place, knowing that the next time I saw Emily, it would be to deliver the final blow. I didn't have to wait long. A few days later, Sarah called to let me know that the papers were ready and the subpoena was in hand. "You can serve her yourself if you want," she said, "or we can have someone else do it. It's up to you." "I'll do it," I replied, not even hesitating. This was something I needed to do myself. I needed to see the look on her face when she realized it was over, that there was no coming back from this. That evening, I drove to the small apartment where she had been staying since I kicked her out. It was a rundown place, a far cry from the home we had shared, but it was all she could afford now that her finances were in ruins. I felt a grim satisfaction as I pulled into the parking lot, knowing that she had been forced to live with the consequences of her actions. I didn't call ahead or let her know I was coming. I wanted this to be a surprise. As I walked up to her door, my heart was pounding, not with fear or anxiety, but with a cold, steely resolve. This was it. The end. I knocked on the door, the sound echoing in the dimly lit hallway. It took a moment, but then I heard footsteps from inside, slow and hesitant. The door opened, and there she was, Emily, looking worn and tired, her eyes puffy from crying, her once perfect appearance now frayed around the edges. She stared at me, surprise and confusion written all over her face. "Jake?" she said, her voice soft, almost disbelieving. "What are you doing here?" I didn't say anything at first. I just looked at her, taking in the sight of the woman who had once meant everything to me, now reduced to a shadow of her former self. Then, without a word, I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the subpoena, handing it to her. She frowned, her eyes flicking between the papers and my face. "What is this?" she asked, her voice shaky. "It's over, Emily," I said, my voice cold and detached. "I'm filing for divorce." Her eyes widened, and for a moment she just stared at the papers, as if she couldn't quite process what was happening. Then she looked up at me, panic and desperation creeping into her expression. "No, Jake, please," she pleaded, her voice trembling. "Don't do this. We can work through this. We can go to counseling. We can—" "There's nothing to work through," I interrupted, my tone sharp. "You killed our marriage the moment you decided to cheat. This is the only way forward now." Tears welled up in her eyes, spilling down her cheeks as she clutched the papers to her chest. "I'm sorry, Jake," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I know I messed up. I know I hurt you, but please don't do this. We can fix it." "I'll do whatever it takes, I swear." Her words, once so powerful, now meant nothing to me. I had heard it all before. The apologies, the promises, the desperate attempts to patch things up. But I knew they were hollow, just like everything else that had come out of her mouth since the affair began. "It's too late, Emily," I said, my voice flat. You should have thought about that before you decided to betray me. There's nothing left to fix. It's over. She shook her head, her tears falling faster now, her voice growing more frantic. Please, Jake, please, I'll do anything. Just don't end it like this. I looked at her, feeling nothing but a cold emptiness where love had once been. She had made her choices, and now she had to live with the consequences. There was no room for mercy, no place for second chances. Not anymore. I'm done, Emily, I said quietly. I've already made up my mind. You'll get your copy of the divorce papers in a few days. After that, it's just a matter of time before everything is finalized. There's nothing you can do to change it. She sobbed, clutching the papers like they were a lifeline she couldn't bear to lose. But Jake, I love you. Her words hung in the air, a pathetic attempt to cling to something that was long gone. I stared at her, feeling a mix of pity and disdain. Love? I repeated, my voice dripping with sarcasm. Is that what you call this? Because it doesn't look like love to me, Emily. It looks like lies, betrayal, and destruction. She flinched at my words, but I didn't care. She needed to hear the truth, no matter how much it hurt. You threw everything away, I continued, my voice hardening. You threw us away, and now you have to deal with the consequences. You don't get to cry your way out of this. Her sobs grew louder, her body shaking as she tried to find the words to fight back. But there was nothing left for her to say. She had lost, and she knew it. Jake, please, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Don't leave me. But I was already gone. I had been gone since the moment I found out about her affair. Since the moment I realized that the woman I loved had become a stranger. There was nothing left to salvage, nothing left to save. I took a step back, my eyes never leaving hers. Goodbye, Emily, I said, my voice cold and final. I hope you find whatever it is you're looking for, but it won't be with me. And with that, I turned and walked away, leaving her standing in the doorway, clutching the subpoena like it was the last shred of hope she had. As I walked down the hallway, the sound of her sobs faded, replaced by the steady beat of my own footsteps. I felt a strange sense of peace, knowing that this chapter of my life was finally closing. When I reached my car, I paused for a moment, taking a deep breath as I looked up at the apartment building. There was no going back now, no second guessing, no regrets. I had made my decision, and I was going to see it through to the end. As I drove away, the weight that had been pressing down on me for so long began to lift. The road ahead was uncertain, and I knew it wouldn't be easy. But for the first time in months, I felt like I was in control of my own life again. I was taking back what was mine, piece by piece, and I wasn't going to let anyone take it from me. Emily had made her bed, and now she was going to lie in it, alone. And as for me, I was moving on, leaving the wreckage of our marriage behind, and starting the process of building something new, something better. This was the end of the line for us, but it was also the beginning of something else, something that in time might finally bring me the peace I had been searching for. The trial was something I had been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. It wasn't just about ending the marriage anymore. It was about finalizing the destruction of the life Emily and I had built together. After everything that had happened, after the lies, the betrayal, the revenge, it all boiled down to this: a sterile courtroom where the remnants of our life together would be picked apart and dismantled. As the day approached, I tried to mentally prepare myself. I knew this wasn't going to be easy, but it was necessary. My lawyer, Sarah, had assured me that we were in a strong position. The evidence of Emily's affair was irrefutable, and with the financial control I had already taken, there wasn't much left for her to contest. But still, I couldn't shake the anxiety that came with the knowledge that this was it, the final act. The courtroom was as cold and impersonal as I'd imagined. The kind of place where lives were unraveled and reassembled according to the dictates of the law. Emily was already there when I arrived, sitting with her lawyer, looking small and defeated. She didn't meet my eyes when I entered, her gaze fixed on the table in front of her. It was a stark contrast to the woman I had once known, confident, full of life. But that woman was long gone, replaced by someone who barely resembled her. I took my seat beside Sarah, and we went over the plan one last time. It was simple, really. Prove the adultery, establish financial misconduct on Emily's part if necessary, and push for the divorce to be granted quickly and cleanly. We had the evidence, and Emily's weak attempts to stall the process with pleas for reconciliation or claims of financial hardship had been easily countered by the steps I'd already taken. The judge entered, a stern-looking woman who wasted no time getting down to business. She had no interest in the personal drama that had led us here. Her focus was solely on the facts, on the law. That was fine by me. I didn't want to relive the details of the affair or the months of emotional turmoil that had followed. I just wanted it to be over. The proceedings started with the presentation of evidence. Sarah laid out everything methodically, the emails, the photos, the texts. Each piece of evidence was like a dagger, stabbing deeper into the remnants of our marriage. I could see Emily flinch with every new revelation, her face growing paler, her hands trembling slightly. Her lawyer tried to object a few times, but the judge wasn't having it. The evidence was clear, undeniable. Emily had cheated, and now she was going to pay the price. When it was Emily's turn to speak, she hesitated, her voice trembling as she addressed the court. She tried to play the victim, painting herself as a woman who had made a mistake, who had been caught up in something she couldn't control. She talked about the loneliness she had felt during our marriage, the distance that had grown between us, and how she had turned to Sam in a moment of weakness. But I could tell from the judge's expression that she wasn't buying it. Emily's excuses rang hollow, her pleas for sympathy falling on deaf ears. This wasn't a therapy session. It was a courtroom, and the judge wasn't interested in hearing about Emily's emotional struggles. She was only interested in the facts, and the facts were damning. When it was my turn to speak, I kept it brief. I didn't need to go into detail. The evidence spoke for itself. I simply stated that the marriage was over, that I had been betrayed, and that I wanted a clean break. I wasn't asking for anything unreasonable, just what I was entitled to after everything that had happened. The judge asked a few questions, mostly about the financial arrangements. Emily had tried to claim that she was entitled to more than I was offering, citing the years she had spent as a homemaker and the contributions she had made to our life together. But Sarah had anticipated this and had already prepared a counter-argument, showing that Emily had been more than adequately compensated during our marriage, and that the financial decisions I had made since the separation were well within my rights. The trial moved quickly after that. There wasn't much left to contest, and it was clear that Emily's attempts to delay the inevitable were futile. The judge listened patiently as her lawyer made a few final arguments, but it was clear that the decision had already been made. When the judge finally spoke, it was with a tone of finality that left no room for doubt. The evidence presented clearly shows that the respondent engaged in an extramarital affair, which directly led to the breakdown of the marriage. The petitioner is entitled to a divorce on the grounds of adultery, and the financial arrangements as proposed are fair and equitable under the circumstances. She looked directly at Emily as she continued, her voice firm. This court is granting the divorce effective immediately. All financial obligations and distributions will be carried out as per the petitioner's request. Miss Hart, you will vacate the marital home and will receive no further spousal support beyond what has already been provided. Emily's face crumpled as the judge spoke, the finality of the situation hitting her like a ton of bricks. The reality that her marriage was over, that she had lost everything, was sinking in. Her lawyer placed a comforting hand on her shoulder, but it did little to soothe the devastation that was written all over her face. I felt a strange mix of emotions as I listened to the judge's ruling. There was satisfaction, of course, a sense of justice served, but there was also a deep sadness, a mourning for the life that had once been, the love that had been so completely and utterly destroyed. It was over, and there was no going back. The judge banged her gavel, signaling the end of the trial. Court is adjourned. I stood up, feeling the weight of the moment settle over me. This was it, the end of a chapter that had defined so much of my life. I watched as Emily slowly gathered her things, her movements sluggish, as if she were in a daze. She looked up at me as I walked past, her eyes filled with tears. "Jake," she started, her voice a whisper, but I shook my head. "There's nothing left to say, Emily," I replied, my voice cold and final. "It's over." She nodded, her tears falling freely now as she clutched her purse to her chest. I turned away from her and walked out of the courtroom, not looking back. There was no point in dwelling on what had been. The future was all that mattered now. Outside, the sun was shining, a stark contrast to the cold, sterile environment of the courtroom. I took a deep breath, feeling the warmth on my skin, the breeze in my hair. It was a new day, a new beginning. Sarah walked out behind me, giving me a small smile. "It's done," she said simply. "Yeah," I replied, nodding. "It's done." As I walked to my car, I felt a sense of relief, of closure. The divorce was final, the marriage officially over. The life Emily and I had shared was gone, reduced to legal documents and court rulings. But it was also a chance to start over, to rebuild from the ashes of what had been. I drove home in silence, the reality of the situation slowly sinking in. There would be no more texts or calls from Emily, no more attempts to fix what was irreparably broken. There was only the future and whatever it held. When I pulled into the driveway of what was now my house, mine alone, I felt a strange sense of peace. The journey to this point had been painful, filled with anger, betrayal, and revenge. But it was over now, and I was ready to move on. As I stepped inside, Max greeted me with a wagging tail, sensing the change in the atmosphere. I patted his head, feeling the tension in my shoulders begin to ease. I was home, and for the first time in months, it felt like a place where I could heal, where I could begin again. I sat down on the couch, looking around the living room that had once been filled with so many memories. Some of those memories were painful now, tainted by what had happened. But they were part of my story, part of what had brought me to this moment. The trial was over. The divorce was final, and Emily was out of my life for good. It was time to close this chapter and start writing a new one. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't happen overnight. But I was ready. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was in control of my life again. I was free, and the future was mine to shape however I chose. And as I sat there, in the quiet of my home, I knew that whatever came next, I would face it head on, with the strength and resolve that had carried me through the darkest days of my life. The weeks following the trial were a strange mix of liberation and loneliness. The divorce was final. Emily was out of my life for good, and I was left alone in the house that had once been our shared home. It was mine now. Every room, every piece of furniture, every memory, both good and bad. But even with that sense of ownership, there was a void that I couldn't ignore. For a long time, I'd thought that once the divorce was final, I'd feel nothing but relief. I imagined that cutting Emily out of my life completely would bring me peace, that I'd be able to move on without looking back. But the reality was more complicated. The anger and hurt had dissipated, leaving behind an emptiness that was harder to fill than I'd anticipated. In the days that followed the trial, I focused on routines. I went back to work, burying myself in projects and tasks that kept my mind occupied. I took Max for long walks in the evenings, exploring the trails near my neighborhood, letting the fresh air clear my head. I spent hours cleaning and organizing the house, getting rid of anything that reminded me of the life I'd once shared with Emily. It was therapeutic in a way, giving me a sense of control over my environment, even if I couldn't yet control how I felt. Friends and family reached out, offering support and encouragement. Some suggested that I start dating again, that I put myself out there and try to find someone new. But the idea of a new relationship felt foreign, almost absurd. I wasn't ready for that, not even close. The wounds were still too fresh, the trust too shattered. The thought of letting someone else into my life, of opening up to the possibility of being hurt again, was more than I could handle. So I made a decision. I wouldn't rush into anything new. I needed time to heal, time to figure out who I was without Emily, time to rebuild my life on my own terms. I wasn't interested in dating or finding a new partner. What I needed was to rediscover myself, to find peace in my own company. The house became my sanctuary, a place where I could retreat from the world and focus on myself. I started reading again, something I hadn't done in years, losing myself in books that took me far away from my own troubles. I picked up hobbies I'd long forgotten, woodworking, painting, things that allowed me to create something tangible, something that wasn't tied to the past. Weekends were spent in the garage, working on projects that filled the silence with the comforting hum of tools and the smell of sawdust. I built shelves, a new coffee table, even a bench for the garden. Each piece was a small victory, a reminder that I was capable of building something new, even if it was just furniture. It gave me a sense of accomplishment, a focus that kept the loneliness at bay. But there were still moments when the emptiness would creep in. Late at night, when the house was too quiet, I'd find myself thinking about everything that had happened, about the life I thought I'd have, and how it had all fallen apart. The memories were still there, lingering like ghosts, and I knew they'd take time to fade. I started seeing a therapist, something I'd resisted for a long time. It wasn't easy at first, talking about the betrayal, the anger, the revenge, but it helped. But it gave me a place to unpack everything that had been weighing me down, to start sorting through the mess in my head. My therapist, Dr. Gray, was patient, guiding me through the process of healing, helping me understand that it was okay to take things slow, that I didn't need to have all the answers right away. "You've been through a lot, Jake," she said during one session, her voice calm and steady. "It's natural to feel lost after something like this. But healing isn't linear. There will be good days and bad days. The important thing is that you give yourself the time and space to process everything." And that's exactly what I did. I gave myself permission to feel whatever I needed to feel. To grieve, to be angry, to be sad, to be hopeful. I stopped trying to rush through the process, stopped trying to force myself to move on before I was ready. I let the healing happen at its own pace, trusting that eventually I'd come out the other side stronger. I also began to reconnect with old friends, people I'd lost touch with during the marriage. We'd go out for drinks, catch a game, or just hang out and talk. It was a reminder that there was still a life outside of the one I'd lost, that I still had connections and people who cared about me. Those friendships became a lifeline, pulling me out of the solitude I'd wrapped myself in, reminding me that I wasn't truly alone. But even as I reconnected with others, I kept my focus inward. I wasn't looking for validation from anyone else. I was working on finding it within myself. I started practicing mindfulness, meditation, anything that helped me stay grounded in the present, rather than getting lost in the past or worrying about the future. It wasn't always easy. Sometimes the thoughts would creep in, the doubts, the regrets. But I was learning how to manage them, how to let them pass without letting them consume me. The holidays were the hardest. Christmas, New Year's, times that had always been about family, about togetherness. I spent them alone, by choice, not wanting to force myself into social situations that would only highlight what I was missing. Instead, I made new traditions for myself, simple things that brought me comfort. I cooked a big meal for myself and Max, watched old movies, and spent the evening reflecting on the year that had passed and what I wanted from the one ahead. By the time spring rolled around, I started to feel a shift. The days were getting longer, the air warmer, and I could feel a weight lifting. I was still healing, still figuring things out, but there was a sense of renewal in the air, a feeling that I was ready to start moving forward, even if it was just one small step at a time. I focused on my health, getting back into shape after months of neglecting myself. I started running again, something I hadn't done since college, and it quickly became a new passion. The rhythm of my feet hitting the pavement, the rush of endorphins, the way my mind would clear with every mile. It was exactly what I needed. It gave me a sense of control over my body, over my life, something I had been sorely missing. Running led to other forms of exercise, weightlifting, yoga, things I had never tried before but found surprisingly therapeutic. I started cooking more, paying attention to what I was putting into my body, treating it like the temple it was. The results were slow, but steady. I felt stronger, more energized, more in tune with myself than I had in years. Throughout all of this, I stayed true to my decision not to pursue new relationships. It wasn't that I was closing myself off to the idea forever, but I knew I wasn't ready yet. I wasn't looking for someone to fill the void left by Emily. I was working on filling it myself. I needed to be whole on my own before I could even think about letting someone else in. As time went on, I found myself enjoying my own company more and more. The loneliness that had once felt so overwhelming began to fade, replaced by a sense of contentment, of peace. I started to appreciate the quiet moments, the stillness of the house, the freedom to do whatever I wanted, whenever I wanted. There was no one else to consider, no one else to please, and for the first time that felt like a gift rather than a burden. I also began to rediscover passions and interests that I'd let slip away during the marriage. I traveled, visiting places I'd always wanted to see but had never made time for. I took up photography, capturing the beauty of the world around me, finding joy in the simple act of creation. I read books I'd always meant to read, took classes in subjects I'd never explored, and allowed myself to be curious, to learn, to grow. Through it all, Max remained my constant companion. He was there during the darkest days, offering unconditional love and loyalty when I needed it most. And now, as I began to rebuild my life, he was right there with me, reminding me that even in the midst of all the chaos and pain, there was still good in the world, still love to be found. As the months passed, I could feel the change in myself. I was no longer the man who had been consumed by anger and revenge, who had been broken by betrayal. I was someone new, stronger, wiser, more self-assured. I had faced the worst and come out the other side, scarred but not defeated. And while I wasn't actively seeking out new relationships, I knew that one day I might be ready for that too. But it would be on my terms, when I was truly ready, and not a moment before. For now, I was content to focus on myself, on my own journey, knowing that whatever the future held, I was strong enough to face it. Life after Emily was not what I had expected. It was harder, lonelier, and at times more painful than I had imagined. But it was also liberating, empowering, and ultimately, a path to finding myself again. I had been through hell and back, but I was still standing, still moving forward one day at a time, and that, I realized, was enough. For now, it was more than enough.